The smell of burning diesel clung to the air like a curse, thick and choking, mixing with the metallic tang of blood that coated the dust. Sergeant Daniel Kane didn't need to look at the black smoke rising from the convoy to know what had happened. He'd heard the thunderclap of the explosion, felt the shockwave punch into his ribs, watched the Humvee ahead of his erupt in fire and torn steel. His ears still rang. The world had gone muted, except for the distant crack of rifles and the sharp cries of his men. "Contact front! Contact front!" a voice shouted, dragging him back into the chaos. Kane slammed the door of his Humvee open, boots sinking into the sand. The world exploded in sound now, the staccato bursts of AK fire, the angry cough of machine guns, the pop-pop of rounds snapping past his head. He dove for the ditch, adrenaline drowning out hesitation. His M4 was already in his hands, safety flicked off, finger curled tight on the trigger. He returned fire, short, controlled bursts at the muzzle flashes sparking from the shattered buildings ahead. "Ramirez, get that saw up." Kane barked, his voice steady, authoritative, even though his heart hammered like a jackhammer in his chest. He had no time to think about the men burning in the Humvee ahead. Later. There was a later. The gunner scrambled into position, laying down suppressing fire, the rattle of the M249 filling the air. The enemy had the high ground, well-placed, well-prepared. This wasn't random. They'd been waiting. A scream cut through the firefight. Private Jensen, fresh out of training, clutched his leg, blood pouring between his fingers. Kane crawled to him, bullets tearing up dirt inches from his head. He grabbed Jensen by the collar, dragging him behind the cover of the ditch. "Stay with me, kid. Pressure here." "Hold it tight," Kane ordered, forcing Jensen's trembling hands onto the wound. His eyes flicked back to the street. His men were pinned, 2 down already, and the rest scattered, barely keeping the ambush from swallowing them whole. "Kane, we can't hold here." Staff Sergeant Miller yelled from across the ditch, returning fire. "We're sitting ducks." Kane knew it. Every second they stayed, the enemy tightened the noose. He had 2 choices: stay pinned until they were overrun or take the fight to the bastards. Neither was good. But in war, good choices didn't exist, only the ones that kept men breathing longer. He pulled the radio from his vest, calling into the chaos. "Viper 2-1, this is Reaper 6, troops in contact, ambush grid 26 Alpha. We need immediate air or artillery, how copy?" Static hissed back at him. Then finally, "Reaper 6, this is Viper 2-1. Air support unavailable, artillery out of range. You're on your own." "Over." Kane gritted his teeth. On their own. That phrase, cold and final, sent a ripple through his gut. He shoved the thought away. His men were looking to him. "Miller. Flank left with Ramirez. Get eyes on that building." Kane shouted. "I'll push center with Clark. Move on my go." "Roger." Miller snapped, already signaling Ramirez. Kane slapped Clark on the shoulder, the young corporal's face pale but determined. They locked eyes, understanding unspoken. On Kane's mark, they surged from cover, rifles spitting fire as they sprinted toward the wreckage of the burning Humvee. Heat washed over them, the air shimmering, carrying the stench of charred flesh. Kane forced it down, compartmentalized it. Later. Always later. Rounds zipped past, chipping concrete, sparking off twisted metal. Kane dropped to a knee, firing controlled bursts, drawing fire away from Miller's team. He saw muzzle flashes in a second-story window and zeroed in, squeezing until the rifle bucked. A body slumped, disappearing from view. 1 less. 100 more waiting. "Frag out." Clark yelled, lobbing a grenade into a collapsed storefront. The blast rattled Kane's bones, dust and glass showering the street. Screams followed, high-pitched, then silenced. Miller and Ramirez pushed into position, Ramirez's saw hammering the window frames. Miller shouted, "We've got an opening. Push now." Kane waved his team forward. They rushed the nearest building, kicking in the door with practiced violence. Inside was dark, claustrophobic, the air thick with dust. Movement, Kane fired, a shadow crumpling before him. Clark swept left, Miller right, Ramirez covering the rear. They cleared room by room, each heartbeat a drumbeat of survival. Up the stairs, Kane's boot crunched on glass. He froze. A tripwire glinted faintly in the shaft of sunlight cutting through the wall. Improvised trap. "Back," he hissed, stopping Clark mid-step. His eyes tracked the wire to a crude explosive rigged against the wall. One wrong move and half the squad would have been shredded. Kane's throat tightened. They weren't just fighting men. They were fighting ghosts, engineers of death who knew every street, every shadow. He cut the wire carefully, heart pounding, and motioned his team on. At the top they found the shooters, a cluster of insurgents reloading frantically. The firefight was brutal, point blank. Kane's rifle kicked against his shoulder, the smell of gunpowder choking him, shouts and screams mixing in a blur of violence. When it ended, silence filled the room, broken only by the ragged breathing of his men. Bodies sprawled across the floor, blood seeping into the cracked tiles. "Clear," Miller said, voice hoarse. Kane nodded, scanning the window. From here he could see the rest of his squad regrouping in the street, dragging the wounded to cover. They'd survived the ambush for now. But Kane's mind wasn't on the victory. It was on the trap. The waiting. The precision. This wasn't random. Someone had known they'd be here. Someone had fed intel to the enemy. Back at the makeshift FOB hours later, the adrenaline gone, exhaustion set in like lead. The wounded were patched, the dead zipped into bags. Kane sat on an ammo crate, stripping his rifle with mechanical precision. The silence between the men was heavy, filled with ghosts they couldn't name. Miller finally broke it. "They knew we were coming. You saw it too." Kane didn't look up. "Yeah. Someone's talking. Someone close." "You think it's one of ours?" Kane paused, a flicker of doubt gnawing at him. "I think we don't know. And that makes it worse." They sat in silence again. Outside, generators hummed, laughter echoed faintly from another squad trying to forget the day. Kane envied them. He couldn't shake the smell of burning diesel, the sight of the tripwire, the scream of Jensen. Later, lying in his cot, he stared at the ceiling of the tent, sleep a stranger. His men looked to him for certainty, for leadership. But inside doubt whispered. Not about his decisions in battle. Those were instinct, honed by years of blood and fire. The doubt was deeper, insidious. Someone had set them up. And if the enemy knew their routes, their patrols, their weaknesses, then every step forward was a step into a minefield. He closed his eyes, but all he saw was the convoy burning, the bodies sprawled in the dust. Tomorrow they'd roll out again. And tomorrow the enemy would be waiting. War didn't stop. It only paused long enough to remind you were still alive. And Kane, whether he liked it or not, had to keep leading his men into the fire. The sun was already punishing by the time Sergeant Daniel Kane rolled out with his squad again, its heat pressing down through body armor like an extra layer of weight. The convoy rumbled out of the wire, engines growling, tires crunching gravel. Dust clouds trailed behind them, hanging in the air like ghosts. Every soldier in those vehicles carried the memory of yesterday's ambush. The dead were buried, the wounded flown out, but the silence in the trucks told Kane all he needed to know. No one had let it go. "Eyes sharp, boys. They'll be waiting for us again," Kane said over the intercom, scanning the horizon through the narrow glass of the Humvee. He kept his voice steady, calm. His men didn't need to hear the uncertainty gnawing at him. Private Jensen wasn't with them. The kid had been medevaced, alive but broken. The squad's lineup looked smaller, quieter without his nervous chatter. Kane found himself listening for it, and the silence cut deeper than the desert wind. Corporal Clark manned the turret, sweat streaming down his face beneath his helmet. "Sir, I got a bad feeling about this route," he muttered, not breaking his scan. "It's too damn quiet." Kane's jaw tightened. Quiet was never good out here. Quiet meant eyes on you waiting. Miller's voice crackled through. "HQ says we're sweeping through Sector 3, checking on reports of weapons caches. But I swear they're sending us blind. No drone overwatch, no recon. Just us." Kane didn't reply right away. Orders were orders, but Miller was right. Yesterday's ambush had been too perfect, too informed. And now they were being sent out again, same roads, same sector, no support. It felt like bait. He keyed the radio. "Reaper squad copies. Continuing mission." He clipped it back, then leaned forward. "Miller, keep your men tight." Ramirez's eyes left. "Clark, don't hesitate to light up anything that twitches." They rolled into the village by midday, the heat shimmering off rusted tin roofs and crumbling stone walls. Children darted into alleys at the sight of the convoy, women pulling scarves tighter, doors slamming shut. The street emptied like someone had blown a whistle. "Dead giveaway," Ramirez muttered, his eyes hidden behind dusty goggles. Kane raised his fist and the convoy halted. The silence pressed in, broken only by the hum of the Humvee engines. He scanned the windows, the rooftops, the alleys. Somewhere in those shadows, death waited. He could feel it. Then came the crack. A single rifle shot echoed, and a round smacked into the side of the lead Humvee, throwing sparks. "Contact right." Clark bellowed from the turret, the .50 cal roaring to life, sending thunder down the street. The squad dismounted instantly, spreading out, weapons up. Bullets rained from the windows, muzzle flashes like fireflies in the darkness. Ramirez, suppress that rooftop. Clark, shift fire to the alley. Kane barked, moving with purpose. He fired into the nearest window, the M4 jerking against his shoulder, glass shattering. He felt the rhythm of combat settle into his bones again. But this time the enemy was ready for their response. RPG smoke trails hissed through the air, slamming into the second Humvee. The explosion tossed metal like confetti, fireball rising high. Kane hit the dirt, ears ringing, the shockwave punching his lungs. Medic? We need a medic. Miller's voice cut through the smoke, ragged, panicked. Kane forced himself up, vision blurred, ears buzzing. Through the haze he saw men crawling from the wreck, some not moving at all. He sprinted forward, dragging one of the wounded clear, blood soaking his gloves. He didn't stop to check if it was his or theirs. He pulled the soldier behind cover, then turned back to the street, anger boiling through the numbness. They were being picked apart systematically. First the lead vehicle yesterday, now the middle one. Whoever was running these ambushes knew how to cripple a convoy. Kane, we can't stay in this kill zone. Miller shouted, dragging another man. I know. Kane's voice was sharp. He keyed the radio. Reaper to HQ, we are under heavy contact, multiple casualties. Requesting immediate support, grid 39 Delta. Static. Then cold, flat, negative Reaper. Support unavailable. Complete the mission. Over. Complete the mission. Kane almost laughed at the absurdity, the insanity of it. His men were bleeding, burning, and command wanted a weapons cache sweep. He wanted to scream into the radio, curse them out. Instead he shoved it back into his vest and kept firing. Clark. Put that 50 on the far side building, clear us a path. Miller were pushing left flank, smoke out. Grenades hissed, smoke filling the street, covering their advance. The squad surged forward, moving building to building, clearing with brutal efficiency. Kane kicked in a door, firing before the insurgent inside could raise his rifle. Blood sprayed across the wall and Kane pushed deeper, Miller at his side. The fight devolved into close quarters chaos. Stairs, hallways, rooms filled with shadows and gunfire. Each corner could mean death. Kane's arms ached, his throat raw from shouting commands, his body running on adrenaline fumes. But step by step they pushed the enemy back. Finally the firing slowed, then stopped. The last insurgent fell, Miller's burst tearing him down as he tried to reload. The building fell silent, the acrid stink of cordite hanging heavy. Clear, Ramirez called from the rooftop. Kane exhaled, chest heaving. His men slumped against walls, faces pale beneath grime, eyes wide and hollow. They'd survived again, but the cost was brutal. 3 dead, 4 wounded, and the convoy down to skeleton strength. He stood at the window, staring out at the smoke still rising from their wrecked Humvee. The village lay silent again, doors shut, windows dark. He wondered how many of the faces hiding behind those walls had been watching, cheering. Miller came up beside him, voice low. This isn't random. They're feeding on us, picking the routes, the times. Somebody's giving them our playbook. Kane didn't answer right away. He wanted to deny it, to chalk it up to bad luck or enemy cunning. But deep down he knew Miller was right. Yesterday's ambush, today's, even the exact placement of RPGs. They were too precise, too informed. Someone was bleeding intel. We can't tell the men, Kane said finally. Not yet. We give them ghosts to chase, they'll lose their heads. We keep it tight until we know. Miller nodded grimly, but the doubt in his eyes mirrored Kane's own. By the time they limped back to base, dusk had settled, painting the horizon blood red. The bodies of their dead were loaded into black bags, zipped shut with quiet finality. The wounded were stabilized, for lines dangling, medics moving with weary precision. The squad gathered in the barracks, helmets off, sweat drying into white crusts on their uniforms. Silence weighed heavy, broken only by the occasional cough or the sound of a weapon being cleaned. Ramirez finally spoke, his voice low. Sir, this ain't just bad luck. They're too damn good. Somebody's setting us up. Kane looked at him, then around the room. The faces staring back were expectant, desperate. They wanted answers he didn't have. We adapt, Kane said finally, his tone firm. We hit harder, move smarter. If someone's feeding them intel, then we change the playbook. No one outside this room hears a word about where we're headed. We lock it down. Clear? The men nodded, some slower than others, but they nodded. Kane forced himself to believe it would be enough. Later, alone in the dim barracks, he pulled out the radio log. He scanned the transmissions, the timings. Somewhere in this mess was a clue, a leak. But staring at the paper he felt the same as he had in the kill zone. Trapped, targeted, outmaneuvered. Sleep didn't come. Every time he closed his eyes he saw the explosion, the bodies flung through fire, the screaming faces of his men. He thought of the words from HQ, complete the mission, and felt his anger simmer. Command had hung them out to dry. At dawn, Kane sat outside, the desert air cold and biting before the sun rose. He lit a cigarette, the smoke curling into the pale sky. Miller joined him, silent for a long while. Finally Miller said, "You ever think maybe it ain't just one leak? Maybe the whole damn chain's rotten?" Kane stared at the horizon, the cigarette burning down to ash between his fingers. He didn't answer. But in his gut, he knew the truth was darker than any of them wanted to admit. War was never simple. And this one was about to get a whole lot messier. The desert had a cruel way of reminding soldiers that it wasn't just the enemy they had to fight. Heat waves shimmered off the ground, the kind that bent the horizon like glass. Sergeant Daniel Kane sat hunched in the back of the Humvee, helmet tilted low, eyes scanning the dust-choked road as the convoy crawled forward. The mission brief had been thin, laughably thin. Patrol to Sector 4, recon suspected weapons movement, report findings. Nothing about yesterday's ambush, nothing about the men they had lost. It was as if command had erased it from memory. But Kane couldn't erase anything. He still saw the burning Humvee when he blinked, still heard the screams over the radio, still smelled diesel and blood. His squad carried the same ghost. They sat silent, rifles across their laps, each man locked in his own head. Even Ramirez, usually quick with a crude joke, just stared out the window with clenched jaw. "Sector 4, huh?" Miller said finally, voice rough in the radio net. "That's about the dumbest thing I ever heard. Place is crawling with fighters. We'll be lucky to make it 2 clicks before they light us up." Kane keyed the mic, "Then we don't give them the chance. Eyes out, weapons tight. No routine. No patterns. If someone's feeding them intel, we change the script." "You think that's enough?" Miller asked. "It's what we've got," Kane replied and left it there. They rolled into the outskirts of Sector 4 just after noon. The sun glared like an interrogation lamp, baking sweat into armor. The village they approached looked deserted, too deserted. Laundry hung limp on lines, doors ajar, food stalls empty. Even the dogs were gone. Kane's gut nodded. Villages emptied themselves when something ugly was coming. "Clark," Kane said quietly, "sweep high. Ramirez, cover left flank. Miller, get your fire team ready to dismount on my signal." The convoy slowed. Engines growled. Every creak of suspension, every crunch of gravel under tires felt amplified, like they were walking across broken glass in a cathedral. Then the first shot rang out. It wasn't close, but it was enough. The convoy slammed to a halt. "Sniper. 2 o'clock rooftop." Clark yelled, .50 cal hammering in response. The heavy gun roared, brass clattering onto the roof of the Humvee. Windows shattered, plaster exploded into dust, but the sniper's shot had already found its mark. One of the rear gunners dropped, his weapon clattering uselessly. "Dismount! Dismount!" Kane shouted, hitting the ground running. His boots pounded the dirt as he dove for the cover of a broken wall. Bullets zipped and whined around him, the air filled with that too familiar music of chaos. Enemy fighters spilled from alleys, from doorways, from rooftops. Dozens of them, maybe more. Kane cursed under his breath. They weren't just being harassed, they were being hunted. "Miller, suppress that alley. Ramirez, frag right side. Move." Grenades sailed, detonations rocking the street. Dust and screams filled the air, bodies tumbling. Kane swung his rifle up, sighted center mass, and squeezed. A fighter crumpled, another took his place. They just kept coming. Clark's voice cut through. "Reloading." The .50 cal fell silent, and in that heartbeat of quiet, an RPG screamed through the smoke. "Down?" Kane bellowed. The rocket slammed into the lead Humvee, fireball ripping metal apart. The shockwave knocked him onto his back, ears ringing, vision white-hot. He scrambled up, head spinning, forcing himself back into the fight. "Sir, we're cut off." Ramirez shouted, spraying rounds into the wave of insurgents pouring down the side street. Kane took stock in seconds. The convoy was crippled, half the vehicles smoking wrecks. His squad was scattered, pinned, fighting tooth and nail just to stay alive. He could retreat, pull them back toward the FOB, but that would mean abandoning vehicles, supplies, maybe wounded men. Or he could push forward, through the ambush, bleed for every inch of ground and maybe, just maybe, claw them out of the trap. The choice came fast, brutal, and unforgiving. Kane didn't flinch. "We push." Miller, left flank. Ramirez, cover me. He surged forward, firing as he moved, heart hammering in his chest. Miller's team followed, a wall of lead keeping the enemy ducking. They reached the first building and forced their way inside. Kane kicked open the door, rifle barking, clearing room after room with cold precision. The enemy hadn't expected them to push. That hesitation gave them a sliver of ground, enough to regroup, enough to breathe. Kane, second floor's clear. Clark called down. Good. Get up there with Ramirez and start laying hate on those rooftops. Keep their heads down. Kane leaned against the wall, chest heaving, sweat burning his eyes. The fight was far from over, but they'd carved out a foothold. For now that had to be enough. Outside the street was a war zone. Smoke choked the sky, the ground littered with bodies and burning debris. His radio crackled, HQ finally checking in. Reaper 6, this is Viper 2-1. Sit rep, over. Kane grabbed the handset, voice sharp. We are in heavy contact, multiple vehicles destroyed, multiple casualties. Immediate support required, grid 4-2 Bravo. There was a pause, too long, too cold. Then, negative Reaper. Support unavailable. Hold position and complete mission. Over. The words hit Kane like a punch to the gut. His grip tightened around the radio. Hold position. Complete mission. They weren't sending help. They'd abandoned them. He shut his eyes for half a second, the weight of it settling in. Then he forced the rage down and keyed his mic, copy Viper. Reaper out. He tossed the radio aside and looked at his men. They were bruised, bleeding, exhausted, but their eyes locked on him. Waiting. Trusting. Depending. He forced steel into his voice. We're not dying in this street. We move, we fight, we get out. Nobody gets left behind. Understood. Yes, Sergeant. They barked back, voices ragged but solid. The fight dragged on for what felt like hours. They cleared buildings, one after another, blood and sweat soaking every inch of progress. Kane moved like a man possessed, instincts guiding him where thought had no time. He saved Miller from a shotgun blast with a split-second shot. He dragged Ramirez back after shrapnel tore his arm. He kept pushing because if he stopped, even for a heartbeat, the weight of it all would crush him. By dusk, the village was silent again. The last shots faded into echoes. The enemy had melted away, slipping into alleys, disappearing like smoke. Kane stood in the middle of the street, rifle low, chest heaving, sweat and blood staining his gear. Around him, the wreckage of another battle. More dead. More wounded. They'd survived, but survival felt hollow. They hadn't completed a mission, hadn't found a weapons cache. They just bled and killed and clawed through another trap. And command had left them to burn. Back at the FOB, the mood was darker than ever. The dead were counted, their names written down, their bodies bagged. The wounded filled the medic tents, groaning and silent in turns. Kane's men sat in the dirt outside their barracks, too drained to speak. Miller broke the silence at last. We can't keep doing this, Kane. They're feeding us to the wolves. Whoever's up the chain, they don't give a damn if we make it back. Kane didn't argue. He couldn't. The evidence was everywhere, the ambushes, the precision, the lack of support. His men weren't paranoid. They were right. Ramirez spit into the dirt. So what do we do, Sergeant? Keep marching into the meat grinder until there's nobody left. Kane looked at each of them, their faces gaunt and hollow, eyes searching for something to hold on to. He thought about lying, about saying the usual lines. Mission comes first, command has a bigger picture, sacrifices are necessary. But he couldn't force the words. Not anymore. Instead he said quietly, we adapt. We stop trusting anyone but ourselves. No more comms outside the squad. No more sharing routes, no more waiting for support. From here on we fight our way. Our way. The men nodded slowly, one by one. For the first time, Kane saw a flicker of something other than despair in their eyes. It wasn't hope, not yet. But it was resolve. Later that night, Kane lay awake, staring at the canvas roof of the barracks. The desert wind howled outside, rattling the walls. He thought about the missions, the ambushes, the precise way the enemy had been waiting for them. He thought about the cold voice on the radio, telling him to complete the mission while his men burned. And he realized something that chilled him to the bone. This wasn't just bad intel. This wasn't incompetence. This was deliberate. Someone wanted them to die out there. And Kane was going to find out who. The desert was quiet in the hours before dawn, a silence that almost felt holy. Sergeant Daniel Kane sat on a sandbag outside the barracks, boots planted firmly in the dirt, cigarette burning low between his fingers. His men were inside, restless in their cots, some snoring, some muttering in dreams they'd never admit haunted them. Kane hadn't slept. He didn't even try. Sleep brought faces, screams, explosions. He didn't need reminders of what he'd seen. What he needed were answers. The ambushes were too precise. The lack of support was too consistent. His gut told him this wasn't bad luck or even enemy brilliance. It was betrayal. Someone high up the chain was selling them out, feeding their routes and timetables to the insurgents. He didn't know why, but he knew enough to trust the cold knot in his chest. The barracks door creaked open and Miller stepped out, helmet under his arm, rifle slung. He looked like he hadn't slept either, his eyes shadowed and hard. He didn't speak right away, just lit his own cigarette and stood next to Kane, staring into the horizon where the first hints of gray light stretched over the sand. "You're thinking the same thing I am," Miller said at last. Kane exhaled smoke, watching it curl into the air. "Yeah. Someone's feeding us to the wolves." Miller gave a short, humorless laugh. "Thought maybe I was going crazy. But the way they had those RPGs lined up yesterday? That wasn't luck. That was someone whispering in their ear." "We stopped being predictable," Kane said, his voice low but firm. "We stopped telling HQ our routes. We build our own intel, keep it locked down. Nobody outside the squad hears a word." Miller studied him. "You realize what you're saying? That's going against orders. If command catches wind." "They already abandoned us," Kane snapped, then lowered his voice, forcing control. "We're all we've got. Either we adapt or we end up in more body bags." Miller didn't argue. He didn't have to. Both men knew the truth. The next patrol was scheduled for mid-morning, another sweep and report, with the same vague objectives. Kane gathered his men outside the motor pool. They stood in a rough semicircle, weapons cleaned, armor strapped, faces pale but determined. Ramirez fiddled with his goggles. Clark leaned on his rifle like it was the only thing keeping him upright. The younger privates shifted nervously, avoiding eye contact. Kane looked at them, then spoke with a voice that carried weight. "From here on we do things differently. No more spoon-feeding command our every move. Routes stay between us. If anyone outside this squad asks where we're headed, the answer is, we don't know yet." "Understood." The men exchanged glances. Ramirez was the first to nod. "Understood, Sergeant." One by one the rest followed. Kane saw it in their eyes. They weren't just obeying orders. They were clinging to him, to the belief that he could keep them alive. That was a weight heavier than any rucksack, but Kane bore it without flinching. They rolled out just after the sun broke the horizon, engines growling, dust rising behind them like smoke. But this time Kane had taken them off the book route. He studied the maps the night before, choosing a path that wound through dry riverbeds and abandoned fields instead of the main road. It was rough terrain, slow going, but that was the point. If the enemy was waiting, they'd be waiting on the official route. Hours passed. The heat grew oppressive. Sweat soaked their uniforms, their water ran low. But the ambush never came. The convoy made it to the target village unscathed. The village itself was a scatter of stone houses, crumbling walls and rusting corrugated metal roofs. Children peeked out from behind doors, vanishing when the soldiers dismounted. Kane raised his hand. "Check perimeters. Clark, Ramirez with me." They moved through the village, scanning for weapons caches, questioning locals. The answers were the same: shrugs, blank stares, silence. Nobody knew anything or nobody wanted to say. Kane couldn't blame them. To the villagers, every man with a rifle was a threat, whether American or insurgent. Inside one of the houses, Kane crouched near a pile of old crates. He pried one open, half expecting grain or tools. Instead, he found rifles wrapped in cloth, magazines stacked neatly. An entire cache hidden in plain sight. "Got something?" he called. Miller came in whistling low. "Bingo. Enough firepower to arm a platoon." They cataloged the find, snapped photos, marked coordinates. It was the first real success they'd had in weeks. But Kane felt no victory, only unease. If this was here, what else was hidden? And why hadn't HQ Intel mentioned it? On the drive back, Ramirez finally broke the silence. "You notice something? No ambush. Not a single shot fired." "Because we didn't take the route they expected," Kane said. Miller nodded grimly. "Proves it then. They knew where we were supposed to be. They just didn't know where we'd actually go." The men absorbed that in silence, the truth settling like a weight none of them could shake. Back at base, Kane filed the report, leaving out the exact details of their route. HQ didn't question it. They never did. But Kane noticed the way one of the officers, Captain Willis, lingered over his paperwork, eyes sharp, smiled too polite. It was gone in an instant, but it left Kane uneasy. That night, Kane couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He lay on his cot, staring at the shadows, listening to the soft snores and restless murmurs of his men. Somewhere in the base, someone knew he was playing a different game now. Someone was wondering if he'd caught on. The next morning, orders came down for another patrol. Different sector, same vague objective. Kane gathered his squad, but this time he pulled Miller aside. "We're splitting routes," Kane whispered. "I'll take the official one light and fast. You take the squad on my path from last night. We see which one gets hit." Miller frowned. "You're using yourself as bait." Kane gave a small hard smile. "Better me than all of us." The plan was set. Kane rolled out with only Clark in the Humvee, keeping the convoy light, pretending to follow orders. The official route was clean, freshly swept of IEDs. Too clean. It screamed setup. Kane's gut twisted tighter with every mile. Halfway through the sector it happened. The crack of a rifle shot shattered the silence, followed by the whoosh of an RPG. The explosion rocked the ground, smoke billowing. Kane slammed the wheel, skidding the Humvee into cover, rounds pinging off the armor. "Contact!" Clark shouted, manning the turret, .50 cal barking thunder into the rooftops. Insurgents poured into the street, too many, too fast. Kane grabbed the radio. "Reaper 6 to Miller, confirm status." Static hissed, then Miller's voice came through, breathless but calm. "We're clear. No contact. Nothing out here." Kane gritted his teeth. That was it. Proof. The ambush was waiting for the official route, the one only HQ knew they'd take. He fought tooth and nail to get out, Clark laying down fire as Kane gunned the engine, swerving through narrow alleys, bullets hammering the armor. They broke contact by sheer will and speed, the Humvee battered but still rolling. When they limped back to base, Kane's face was hard as stone. His squad crowded around, listening as he told them what happened. Silence hung heavy when he finished. "So it's true," Ramirez muttered. "We're not crazy. Someone's setting us up." Miller looked at Kane. "What now?" Kane met his eyes, his voice low but full of fire. "Now we stop playing their game. If command wants to bleed us, let them try. From here on we fight for us. And we find out who the hell is selling us out." The men nodded, a spark of defiance lighting in their eyes. For the first time in weeks they weren't just surviving. They had a purpose. But in the shadows of the FOB, Captain Willis watched them from a distance, his expression unreadable. And Kane felt the weight of a new war pressing down. A war not just against insurgents in the desert, but against something far more dangerous within his own ranks. The desert at night had a sound all its own. Not silence, not truly. There were whispers of wind over sand, the crackle of distant radios, the metallic clink of weapons being checked and rechecked. Sergeant Kane sat on the hood of the battered Humvee, helmet resting beside him, his rifle across his knees. His squad was inside the barracks, grabbing what little rest they could after the day's chaos. But Kane's mind churned like a storm. He couldn't stop replaying the ambush. The clean road. The sudden eruption of fire. Miller's sector untouched. No more doubts. Someone in their own command had drawn the enemy map with their blood. And he had a name in his head now. Captain Willis. The man's smile when Kane filed his report, the way he lingered over the paperwork, the two casual glances across the chow hall. Kane had been in the army too long to miss what he saw in those eyes. That wasn't leadership. That was someone calculating. Watching. Miller walked up quietly, boots crunching the gravel. "You're not even trying to sleep anymore, are you?" Kane shook his head. "Sleep's a luxury. Not while someone's painting targets on our backs." Miller leaned against the Humvee, folding his arms. His face was shadowed, but his voice was steady. "You think it's Willis?" Kane's jaw tightened. "I know it. You've got no proof." "I've got enough," Kane growled. "The bastard knew our routes. He's the one signing off on the reports. He's the leak, Miller." Miller didn't argue. Instead he said quietly, "So what's the play? You planning to walk up and accuse a captain in front of the brass? They'll eat you alive. Call you paranoid. Strip your stripes." Kane glanced toward the dimly lit HQ tent, guards posted outside. "We catch him in the act. Hard proof. That's the only way." Miller studied him, then finally nodded. "Then we do it quiet. Just you, me, and the squad. No one else." Kane gave a grim smile. "That's why I keep you around, Miller." The next few days Kane played it careful. He filed the usual reports, kept his face unreadable, acted the obedient sergeant. But he also started a shadow war, double-checking logs, memorizing radio call times, watching who came and went from the HQ tent. And at night, while the base slept, he and Miller pored over copies of their patrol reports, noting every detail Willis had access to. It didn't take long to find the cracks. Routes listed in Kane's reports were mirrored almost perfectly by the insurgent ambushes. But Kane's off-book maneuvers, those he'd kept hidden from Willis, were untouched. That was proof enough for him. But it wouldn't stand in a court-martial. He needed something Willis couldn't talk his way out of. Then fate gave them an opening. 2 days later, new orders dropped. A supply convoy had been hit, survivors calling for reinforcements. Kane's squad was tapped to respond. But when Kane read the briefing, a chill slid down his spine. The route. The timing. It was perfect bait. He gathered the squad around the Humvee. The men looked worn but sharp, eyes on him, waiting. "This isn't a rescue," Kane told them. "This is a setup. They want us to roll in and get chewed apart. I'm not giving them the satisfaction." Ramirez frowned. "So what do we do, Sarge? Just ignore it?" "No," Kane said. "We go. But we go our way. And this time we use it to smoke out the traitor." The squad exchanged uneasy glances. Clark finally asked, "You sure about this?" "I'm sure," Kane said, voice hard. "We either fight this war on our terms or we don't come back at all." They rolled out under the burning sun, engines rumbling, dust clouds trailing behind. But instead of following the marked route, Kane led them wide, cutting through dry gullies, doubling back along ridge lines, keeping them unpredictable. Halfway to the convoy site, Miller's radio crackled. An unfamiliar voice came through, urgent in broken English. "Americans, you are surrounded. Lay down weapons, no survive otherwise." The squad froze. Ramirez swore under his breath. "How the hell do they know where we are?" Kane's blood ran cold. He hadn't filed their actual route. But someone still knew. Which meant someone inside the FOB was feeding live updates. He keyed his radio, voice calm. "Negative. You'll have to try harder than that." He cut the line, then barked to his men, "Out. Defensive positions now." They scrambled, spreading across the ridge. Seconds later, the world erupted. Mortar shells screamed down, blasting the earth into geysers of sand. Gunfire ripped from the Trilene, tracer rounds cutting the air. The squad fought like devils, returning fire in controlled bursts. Ramirez dropped 2 shooters with clean headshots. Clark unleashed the .240, the rattle echoing through the valley. Miller moved like a phantom, cutting angles, laying suppression. Kane directed the fight with a predator's calm. Ramirez right flank. "Clark, keep that barrel hot." "Miller on me." He dashed through smoke and dirt, rallying his men, pulling them back yard by yard. It was chaos, but it was controlled chaos. And in the middle of it, Kane felt the old fire, the battle clarity that stripped away fear and left only the mission. But even as they fought, a question burned in his head. How had the enemy tracked them in real time? The only answer was a radio feed coming from inside their own camp. Finally, after what felt like hours, the gunfire ebbed. The insurgents melted back into the Trilene, leaving bodies and burning vehicles behind. The squad was bruised, bleeding, but alive. Kane wiped grit from his face, scanning the field. "We hold here." Miller checked the wounded. Ramirez sweep for intel. Minutes later, Ramirez jogged back, clutching a battered field radio. "Sarge, you're gonna want to see this." Kane took the device, turning it over. It was American issue, standard gear. But the frequency was tuned not to insurgent chatter, but to the FOB's own encrypted channel. His stomach dropped. This was it. Proof. Someone inside was feeding the enemy their positions directly. He glanced at Miller, eyes hard. "We've got our smoking gun." The ride back to base was silent, heavy. Each man lost in his thoughts, gripping his weapon like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. Kane could feel the weight of what they carried. The radio wasn't just metal and circuits. It was betrayal made tangible. When they rolled through the gate, Captain Willis was waiting. He stood near the HQ tent, arms crossed, that same too-polished smile on his face. "Sergeant Kane," Willis called, voice smooth. "Heard you ran into some trouble out there. Good thing you made it back." Kane climbed from the Humvee, holding the captured radio behind his back. His eyes locked on Willis's, unflinching. "Yeah, trouble seems to find us a lot lately." Willis's smile didn't waver, but Kane saw the flicker in his eyes, nervous, calculating. The squad dispersed, but Miller stayed close, silent as Kane stepped forward. He could feel his men watching from the corner of their eyes, waiting to see what he'd do. Kane's voice was calm, almost casual. "Funny thing, Captain. Enemy had an American radio today. Tuned to our FOB channel." For the first time, Willis's smile faltered. Just a crack, but Kane caught it. "That so?" Well, insurgents scavenge our gear all the time. Nothing unusual. Kane stepped closer, close enough to smell the man's aftershave. Maybe. Or maybe someone's handing them toys fresh from the box. The tension between them was electric, thick enough to choke on. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then Willis clapped Kane on the shoulder, smiling again. Careful with accusations, Sergeant. War does strange things to men's heads. Wouldn't want to see you end up in front of a board. Kane held his gaze, unblinking. Neither would I. Willis walked off, disappearing into the HQ tent. Miller muttered under his breath. He knows. He knows we've got him. Good, Kane said, his voice like steel. Let him sweat. Now we play this smart. We get everything we can, every shred of proof. And when we move, we don't miss. That night, as the base settled into uneasy quiet, Kane sat with the radio on his cot, staring at it like a loaded gun. He knew the next move was the most dangerous of all. Because now it wasn't just about survival. It was about justice. And he wasn't sure if justice would come from the chain of command, or from the barrel of his rifle. The desert morning burned white, sun glaring down like it wanted to cook every man alive. Sergeant Kane crouched by the Humvee, adjusting the straps of his vest. His squad milled around him, quiet, efficient, all business. But beneath the silence was tension, like a live wire humming under their boots. They all knew what Kane knew now, that the enemy wasn't just in the tree lanes and alleyways. The enemy was in their own house. Captain Willis had signed the orders for today's patrol himself. Kane could feel the trap written in every line of it. A straight route, no alternate checkpoints, through villages that had gone silent weeks ago. If Kane had learned anything in his years, it was that silence meant only one thing: waiting. Clark lit a cigarette, his hands shaking just slightly. He tried to hide it, but Kane noticed everything. You think he's setting us up again, Sarge? Kane gave him a sharp look. Don't think. No. And we're not gonna walk into it blind. Miller checked the .240's feed, muttering, so what's the plan this time? Turn around and tell him to shove it? Kane shook his head. We roll. But we roll our way. If Willis wants to feed intel, we'll give him something to chew on. He pulled a folded map from his pocket, spreading it across the hood. The squad gathered close. Kane traced the marked route with his finger. Here's what Willis wrote. Here's what the enemy thinks we're doing. But here's what we're actually doing. He sketched a wide detour through gullies and dry wadis, looping around to high ground overlooking the route. We watch from above. If insurgents show, we'll know damn well who tipped them. Ramirez cracked a grin, teeth white against his dust-caked face. I like it. Beat them at their own game. Not just beat them, Kane said, eyes cold. We catch them in the act. Then there's no walking away from it. The convoy rolled out, 3 Humvees kicking dust across the barren road. Kane's squad rode in the lead, but when they hit the fork in the road, Kane raised his fist. Engines idled. He gave Miller a nod, and the vehicles peeled off the marked route, cutting into the gullies. The silence grew heavy as they climbed to the ridge. From up here they could see the whole valley stretched out like a map, the road winding below, the abandoned huts, the patches of scrub. Too quiet. Always too quiet. They set up positions, weapons trained, scopes scanning. Time crawled. Sweat soaked through their uniforms, dust stung their eyes. And then, like clockwork, the road below came alive. Men emerged from the huts, rifles in hand. A truck rolled out from a tree lean, a heavy machine gun mounted in the bed. Dozens of them, moving fast, setting up along the route their convoy was supposed to take. Clark cursed under his breath. Son of a bitch. He really did it. Kane's jaw clenched. There's your proof, boys. Willis fed them the script. Orders, Sarge? Ramirez asked, fingers tight on the trigger of his saw. Kane considered it. They could open fire now, mow down half the ambush before it started. But that would only solve today. Willis would keep bleeding them tomorrow and the next day until none of them were left. Hold fire, Kane said, voice firm. We let them set. Then we pull back, get this radio up the chain. This ends now. But before they could move, Miller's radio crackled. A voice, smooth and controlled, Captain Willis. Reaper Squad, this is HQ. Report status. Every man froze. Kane picked up the mic, forcing calm into his voice. This is Reaper. Rolling through checkpoint 2, all clear. Over. Pause. Then Willis again, copy that. Stay sharp. The line went dead. Kane exhaled slowly, lowering the radio. Miller's eyes narrowed. He's checking on us. Making sure we're in the kill zone. Yeah, Kane muttered. And now he thinks we are. They began to pull back, slipping from the ridge into the gullies. But then the road below erupted. The insurgents opened fire, not on Kane's empty route, but on another convoy rolling straight into the trap. Kane's stomach dropped. 3 Humvees loaded with supply personnel, oblivious, rolled right into the ambush. The valley lit with muzzle flashes, RPG trails streaking through the air. The lead Humvee exploded, flames swallowing it whole. Screams carried on the wind. "God damn it!" Kane snarled. "They sent another unit down there." "Orders, Sarge?" Ramirez yelled, already swinging his gun toward the fight. Kane didn't hesitate. "Light 'em up. Give those boys a chance." The ridge exploded with fire. Kane's squad unleashed hell, raining lead into the insurgent flanks. Ramirez's saw roared, Clark's .240 hammered, Miller's rifle cracked with precision. Kane picked targets, dropping men with clean shots, shifting constantly, controlled fury. The ambush shattered. Insurgents turned, confused, pinned between Kane's squad above and the convoy below. The trapped soldiers returned fire, rallying under the sudden support. Explosions shook the valley as RPGs flew wild, mortars detonating short. Kane moved like a machine, firing, reloading, shifting position. Keep pressure. Don't let him regroup. Minutes stretched into lifetimes. Bodies fell. Smoke thickened. And then, finally, the gunfire faltered. Survivors fled into the treeline, vanishing like ghosts. The valley was a graveyard of burning metal and broken men. Kane's squad scrambled down the ridge, linking with the battered convoy. Bloodied soldiers staggered from the wreckage, some dragging wounded, some in shock. Kane grabbed one by the arm. "Who the hell sent you down this route?" The man, a corporal barely out of his teens, stammered, "Orders, from HQ. Captain Willis." Kane's chest went cold. It wasn't just his squad. Willis was feeding every patrol, every convoy straight into the meat grinder. They gathered the wounded, loaded the survivors, and rolled back to base under the weight of their fury. When they arrived, the FOB was buzzing with activity, medics rushing, officers barking. Willis stood near the command tent, clipboard in hand, looking every inch the polished officer. His eyes met Kane's across the yard. For the first time, Kane didn't see calculation. He saw recognition. Willis knew he'd been caught. That night, Kane gathered his squad in the barracks. The air was thick with anger, exhaustion, and something darker, resolve. "He's killing our people," Clark said flatly. "Not just us. Everyone." "How many more?" Ramirez slammed a fist into the wall. "We can't wait for the brass. By the time they move, half the FOB'll be in body bags." Miller looked at Kane. "So what's it gonna be, Sarge? Chain of command or justice?" The room went silent. Every man's eyes on Kane. He felt the weight of it pressing down, heavier than any rucksack, heavier than the war itself. He'd led them through ambushes, firefights, nightmares. But this, turning their weapons inward, against their own officer, this was a line you didn't cross lightly. And yet he knew if he didn't, Willis would keep bleeding them. Finally Kane spoke. "We gather everything we've got. Radios, logs, survivor testimony. If the brass won't listen, we make them. But if Willis tries to bury this," Kane's voice hardened, steel in every word, "then we bury him." The squad nodded, grim and silent. Later, when the barracks had quieted, Kane sat alone on his cot, staring at the ceiling. The war outside was brutal, relentless. But the war inside was worse. For the first time in his life, Kane wasn't just fighting to survive. He was fighting to decide what kind of soldier, what kind of man he would be when it was all over. Sleep never came. Only the whisper of the desert wind, carrying with it the promise of more blood. The desert wind carried a low, ghostly whistle as Specialist David Kane crouched behind the shattered husk of a burned-out armored vehicle, his rifle snug against his shoulder. The firefight had stretched into its second hour, and the men of Alpha Company were worn down to raw nerve and bone. The enemy wasn't breaking off. They had numbers, and worse, they had patience. Kane's breath rattled inside his helmet. He blinked away the stinging sweat in his eyes and scanned the ridge where enemy fire spat down like sparks from a forge. Sergeant Vega's voice cracked through his headset, urgent, commanding. "Ammo check. Shout it now." 2 mags left. Pardo yelled, his voice frayed with exhaustion. "Down to 1, someone else answered. Kane patted his vest. 3 magazines half full plus the one in his rifle. It wasn't enough. Not for what was coming. Vega swore. "We're not gonna hold much longer. Command says reinforcements are still 15 minutes out." 15 minutes? Kane looked at his men, scattered in cover, bleeding, dirty, eyes wide with the thin edge of panic. 15 minutes might as well have been a lifetime. Another rocket whooshed from the ridge, slamming into the sand behind them and showering the squad in a wave of grit and heat. Kane felt his teeth grind together. They were going to be overrun unless someone changed the tide. "Sergeant." Kane's voice cut through the gunfire. "I can move up the flank. Draw their fire, hit them from the side. Buy us time." Vega spun, face grimy but his eyes sharp. "That's suicide." "Maybe," Kane admitted, "but if we stay put, we're all dead." There was a heartbeat of silence. Vega didn't want to say yes. He didn't want to order a man to throw himself into the meat grinder. But he didn't stop him either. "Do it," Vega finally said, his voice low. "But you better come back." Kane gave a thin smile, chambered around, and darted out from cover. Bullets chewed the dirt at his heels as he sprinted across the open ground. His lungs screamed, his legs pumped like pistons, and his mind narrowed to a razor's edge. He dove behind a jagged outcrop halfway up the ridge, gasping. From here he had a side angle on the enemy positions. He popped up, sighted down his rifle, and squeezed. The first insurgent dropped. He shifted, fired again, another figure crumpled. The enemy's attention whipped toward him like a hive disturbed. Tracer rounds sliced the air. Rocks exploded in sharp bursts around him. He ducked, heart hammering. He knew he couldn't outgun them all, but he didn't need to. He just needed to hold them. Below, Alpha Company rallied, firing harder, shouting, pushing their advantage as the enemy shifted to Kane. The diversion worked. Kane reloaded, muscles shaking, when he heard a click near his feet. He looked down. An enemy fighter barely 20 feet away had crept close, raising a pistol. Time slowed. Kane swung his rifle too late. The pistol barked. But Vega's shot cracked first, dropping the man where he stood. Kane blinked, chest heaving, realizing how close death had just brushed him. "You're welcome, dumbass," Vega barked in his headset. Kane grinned despite the chaos. "Guess you don't get rid of me that easy." Minutes bled into an eternity of lead and smoke, but finally the distant thump of rotor blades rolled over the desert. Reinforcements. Gunships screamed overhead, spitting fire into the ridge. The enemy line buckled, then shattered. Survivors scattered like ants under boiling water. Silence fell, jagged and uneven. Kane slumped against the rock, his whole body trembling. He looked down at his vest. One mag left. That was all. He'd walked the knife's edge and somehow hadn't fallen. Vega climbed up to him, dragging himself over the rocks. He looked at Kane for a long moment, then clapped a hand on his shoulder. "You just saved this company," Vega said quietly. Kane shook his head. "We all saved each other." They regrouped as medics treated the wounded and reinforcements secured the ridge. Bodies lay scattered across the sand, enemy and friendly alike, and Kane felt the familiar churn in his stomach. Victory never felt like victory. It always felt like survival at a cost no one wanted to count. That night, back at the FOB, Kane sat on the edge of his cot, staring at his hands. They were still trembling. He kept seeing the young enemy fighter's face, the one Vega had shot. Barely older than a kid. Sergeant Vega walked into the dimly lit tent, carrying 2 battered mugs of coffee. He handed one to Kane and sat across from him. "You did good out there," Vega said. Kane sipped the bitter liquid. "Didn't feel good." Vega studied him for a moment, then leaned back. "It's not supposed to. You think this is ever clean? It never is. But you make the calls that keep your men breathing. That's the job." Kane nodded, though the weight in his chest didn't lift. The days rolled forward with missions, patrols, and the constant edge of danger. Each fight left new scars on the company, each decision carving deeper into Kane's soul. He found himself stepping up more often, men looking his way when choices needed to be made. Even Vega, hardened and unflinching, started giving him more room to lead. But with every step came heavier burdens. 2 weeks later, intelligence came down. A high-value insurgent leader was operating in a nearby village. Alpha Company was tasked with capturing him alive. The catch: the village was crowded with civilians. Any mistake could turn the mission into a massacre. Inside the briefing tent, tension crackled like static. "This is a surgical job," the captain said. "No heavy ordnance, no collateral. You move quiet, you move precise. We want this guy breathing." Kane felt the unease ripple through the room. These missions were the worst. Rules tight as a noose, stakes sky high. The insertion went smooth, too smooth. The squad moved through the village under cover of night, shadows among shadows. Children slept on rooftops, families huddled in mud brick homes. Dogs barked, then fell silent. They reached the target's compound. Vega signaled. Kane took point, pressing against the wall as the breach team prepared the door. They burst in. The target wasn't there. Instead, they found a stockpile of explosives, enough to level half the village. The air froze. Kane's gut twisted. "It's a trap," he whispered. Gunfire erupted outside. The insurgents had been waiting. Chaos swallowed the night. Bullets ripped through alleys. Civilians screamed and scattered. Kane's squad was pinned inside the compound, enemies pressing from every side. "We can't stay here," Vega shouted over the din. Kane's eyes darted to the explosives. He saw the wires, the crude triggers. The enemy wasn't just trying to kill Alpha Company. They wanted to slaughter the entire village, blame it on the Americans, and turn the people against them. Kane made the call. "We disarm it," he yelled. Vega's eyes widened. "We don't have time." "We make time." Kane barked back. "You hold the line. I'll handle the bombs." Without waiting, Kane dropped to his knees, hands moving fast over the crude wiring. Sweat poured down his face. His training screamed in his head. Red wire, blue wire, but these weren't factory bombs. These were messy, desperate, unpredictable. One wrong move and the whole place went sky-high. Outside, gunfire rattled. Men screamed. The weight of every second pressed down on him. His knife slipped. A wire snapped free. He froze, breath locked in his throat. Nothing. The trigger hadn't armed. Come on, he muttered, working faster, heart pounding. Finally, the last trigger was severed. The bombs were safe. Kane sagged, his body shaking with relief. He grabbed his rifle and rejoined the fight, cutting down 2 insurgents who had broken through the door. Vega's men rallied, pushing back with a fury. Reinforcements arrived minutes later, and the enemy melted into the night. When the dust settled, the villagers peeked from their homes, eyes wide with fear. Kane looked at them, then at the pile of explosives. If he hadn't made the call, those people would have been nothing but ash. The captain commended him later. Vega clapped his shoulder. The men whispered his name with respect. But Kane didn't feel like a hero. He felt hollow, drained, like the desert itself had sucked the marrow from his bones. Weeks turned into months. Battles blurred together. Kane grew harder, sharper, his humor cutting through the dark when the men needed it, his decisions quick when hesitation meant death. Yet every night, when the camp was quiet and the stars stretched cold overhead, he wondered how much of himself he'd already lost out there. On the last night of deployment, after a particularly brutal ambush they barely survived, Kane stood alone at the edge of the FOB, looking out into the endless desert. He'd saved lives. He'd made choices no one wanted to make. He'd become the soldier everyone leaned on. But as the wind whipped across the dunes, carrying with it the ghostly echoes of gunfire and screams, Kane knew the war wasn't done with him. Not by a long shot. Because the real battle, the one inside, was only just beginning. And somewhere deep down, he feared that the war's deadliest secret wasn't hidden in villages or insurgent compounds. It was buried inside him, waiting for the day it came knocking. The end.